Hi, this is Professor Makimura, and today I'm going to talk about the history of early modern Africa. So we're going to talk about how foreign influence and trade impacted the people on the continent. So let me now share a screen. Here we are. Boom. Early modern Africa. So this is a map of Africa that shows you the various languages that people speak in Africa. And I didn't talk about this last time, and I kind of briefly went over how varied the culture and civilization and the peoples are there. But there is also a shared kind of linguistic link in huge parts of Africa. So this part here is basically people who speak a Bantu language. So that's a huge chunk of Africa that they speak a Bantu language. So a Bantu language speakers, linguists propose that they came from around here somewhere, and then they spread over here to Central Africa, and then they pushed further down south. So there is diversity, but there's also a shared commonality when we talk about Africa. And so for this lecture, we're going to try and get to more of that. So we're going to talk about the eastern part of Africa, which is around here. We're going to talk about the southern part of Africa, which is down here. Very little, but it's a little bit. We'll talk about Central Africa. I'm going to try and talk about that, as much as I can, like East Africa. And then we'll talk about West Africa, but not too much of West Africa, but more so than in Southern Africa. Okay. So East Africa. In East Africa, you have the Kingdom of Ethiopia. Ethiopia in the ancient past was called Aksum. And Aksum, in this dark blue, yeah, the color here, had a port that it controlled and it could connect to the Red Sea, and it was actually very prosperous for this reason. But sometime in the Middle Ages, although it's kind of hard to call it the Middle Ages, but if you call it the Middle Ages, but sometime around 900 AD, the Zagwe dynasty emerged to overthrow the kingdom of Aksum, and they took over. And the Zagwe dynasty basically was willing to work with surrounding Muslim countries. That's part of the reason why they were able to overthrow the Aksum kingdom, or so it is said. Um, but when they did so, the price they paid was that they had to get rid of, or they had to cede off, they had to give off the coastal areas. So the Zagwe dynasty became a landlocked country with no access to the sea. And then eventually the Zagwe dynasty itself is overthrown in 1270 AD. And when they're overthrown, uh, the new king claims descent from King Solomon, just like the kingdom of Aksum. And so Ethiopia returns to being a Solomonic dynasty. Uh, so this is sometimes called Abyssinia, but this is basically the Ethiopian empire or the Ethiopian kingdom. And this kingdom is going to last pretty much until the 20th century. Um, so, who are the people of Ethiopia? The people of Ethiopia, the leading peoples are the Amharic speakers, which is a Semitic language, and they are mostly Orthodox. But Ethiopia has a lot of other people in them, and some of their neighbors include people like the Somalis, and there are some ethnic Somalis living in modern day Ethiopia, as you can kind of guess. But the Somalis are over here. They speak a Cushitic language. And for the south on the coast are the Swahili speakers who speak a Bantu language with lots of Arabic loanwords. All right. Both the Somalis and the Swahili speakers tend to be Muslims. All right. So Ethiopia returns to being a Solomonic dynasty by getting rid of the Zagwe dynasty, but they're unable to regain the lost territories near the coast. So they still don't have access to the sea. And it's one of their long-term goals to regain access to the sea. So in this context, you get the contact between the Portuguese and the Ethiopians. So the Portuguese and the Ethiopians make contact in 1493. This is 1 year after Columbus sails the ocean blue. Remember the story of those spies that tried to travel from Portugal to look for Prester John? Well, they discovered a Christian kingdom in the heart of Africa, and it was Ethiopia. And a little later, what happens is they will eventually come into contact with the Portuguese who round Africa and come to Africa from the south by boats. Now this came at a really good time because in 1526 the Adal Sultanate, which is to the east of Ethiopia at the time, basically goes to war against Ethiopia with Ottoman aid. So uh, we think that well, we know that the Ottomans used gunpowder, and we think that the Ottomans probably also provided the Adal Sultanate with gunpowder units as well, or gunpowder weapons as well. Uh, and the Ethiopians basically were surprised by gunpowder. They haven't used gunpowder before, and they were being pushed backwards. They were essentially losing the war. But once the Ethiopians make contact with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese actually bring their help, then the stalemate, then the tide reverses, and the Ethiopians can now push the Adal Sultanate. And eventually, actually, the Ethiopians do actually gain the coast once again. And their long term goal of having a sea route connection to the outside world is restored. Um, so, uh, this does not unfortunately last for them. In 1557, the Ottomans, in their war against the Portuguese and the Ethiopians, push forward once again. And in 1557, the port is once again lost. And this time the port is lost to the Ottomans, not to a local Muslim kingdom. And the Ethiopians basically become landlocked from that point onwards, which is very painful. But they actually continue to get help from the Portuguese, and the Portuguese not only bring gunpowder and know-how on how to use muskets, they also bring Jesuit missionaries, and slowly Christianity in the Catholic faith begins to spread, right? Um, but the Ethiopian people are Orthodox. They're the second country to adopt Christianity. Their version of Christianity is older than Catholic Christianity, or so they think. So, they're not too happy with these new conversions that's happening in Ethiopia. Now, in this period where Ethiopia is cooperating with the Portuguese, you get Emperor Sarsa Dengel, who is able to expand the borders of Ethiopia. But instead of going north to get access to the sea, the Ethiopians actually push south. And eventually, what's going to happen is instead of going north, they're going to push south, and the Ethiopians will basically, control the highlands over here. All right. Now that whole, Jesuit missionaries spreading Catholicism finally bears fruit in convincing Emperor Susenyos to convert to Catholicism. Well, and before he does, his family to convert to Catholicism, so that when Susenyos becomes the emperor in 1626, he declares Catholicism to be the official religion of Ethiopia. And this throws Ethiopia into turmoil. There is now religious conflict over what kind of country Ethiopia is going to be. Is it going to be a traditional Orthodox country, or is it going to adopt this new Catholic religion? And along with this, there's this question about the nature of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but anyway, I don't want to get into the religious nitty gritty here. Um, they have this huge conflict over this, but ultimately, Emperor Susenyos is forced to resign, and Susenyos abdicates in favor of his son, and his son immediately then turns Ethiopia back to being an Orthodox country once again. And to make sure that this doesn't happen again, the Jesuit lands are confiscated. The capital is moved further inland to be away from Portuguese influence. And in 1669, all Catholics are ultimately expelled by Susenyos' grandson. But the religious dissent continues to remain. And you have to wait until Joshua the First, or otherwise known as Iyasu the First, before stability returns. Now, fortunately for Ethiopia, Joshua, reigns for a very long time. So the stability lasts for a good time. But unfortunately for Ethiopia, um, Iyasu the First is assassinated by his own son, and that's the sign that things are going to look bad. Things are going to be bad, and there's now more intense power struggle among the Ethiopian princes, among the Ethiopian aristocracy. So that finally, by 1639, the Ethiopians call this the era of princes. The country plunges into chaos, and internal rebellions, warlords, and aristocrats who basically don't obey the king of kings, who don't obey the emperor, basically run wild and do whatever the heck they want to do. Ultimately, you have to wait until Theodore II, Theodros II, to ascend to the throne. And he is the man who is going to reunify Ethiopia. But his story takes place in 1855. So, it lasts until 1868, which is when Japan has its revolution. So that is a story for the next time when you get to modern Ethiopia. The point here that I want to get across is that contact with the Portuguese certainly benefited Ethiopia temporarily. They were able to regain the port, but in the long run, I mean, it basically just meant that the Ethiopians were got this wave of Catholic conversions and religious dissent. It's like I this is the part where I don't understand. I guess people just don't really believe in religious tolerance that much. So instead of just saying, you have your religion, I have my religion, live and let live, people go, no, my religion is right, your religion is wrong. Not only that, because religion is about the soul, you're going to go to hell if you believe in the wrong religion. So I'm going to do my damnedest to make sure that you believe in the right religion. Like, I'm not that religious, so it's like, seems kind of insane to me that this is the way people think, but apparently that is the way that people thought, and it plunged the country into chaos. So um, I don't know. Was it beneficial or not? It's like a really tough call. All right. So on the East African coast, the arrival of the Portuguese and more intense trade basically meant that uh, more strife. So remember how the Portuguese arrived in the Indian Ocean and they became pirates. Well, not only were they pirates, they also tried to control choke points. And uh, as they were expanding, they were looking for easy places to pick off and to use as a base to control those choke points. So you have these Muslim Arab traders who intermarry with the local Africans and become the elites on the Swahili coast. And you know, the Swahili coast is basically a system of city-states. Each city is its own country, and there's like a loose connection among them, but there's no identity as one country. So it's in this environment that the Portuguese arrive. And when the Portuguese arrive, first they conquer Mozambique. And then once they get into the Indian Ocean here, the first place they conquer is Zanzibar, Zanzibar Island over here, 1503. And then 3 years later, in 1506, Baraba, which is just south of Mogadishu, is sacked by the Portuguese because it was not prepared for a Portuguese, when a Portuguese ship fleet sailed nearby, they didn't see any preparations for defense, so the Portuguese just sacked the city. Now, obviously that sucked for the people of Barawa, but good news for Mogadishu. Mogadishu is just north of Barawa. When they got the news, they began to prepare immediately so that when the Portuguese arrived at Mogadishu, um, the city was well garrisoned and defended. So the Portuguese moved on and they went all the way to Socotra. So Socotra is this island off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Uh, Obviously, it's not going to be here, but it's like, this island off the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. It's near, this mouth between the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. And it was part of the whole, plan to create a choke point. But the problem with Socotra was that it was just not a habitable place. It was just not a good place to live long term. So after 4 years, the Portuguese abandoned the place. And instead, uh, the Portuguese used Oman as their base, which they had conquered earlier in 1507. Later on, the Portuguese will come back to this region and conquer Mombasa, which was one of the more wealthy cities on the Swahili coast. But this Portuguese dominance does not last. If the Portuguese are going to do this, then eventually the locals will fight back. It's not exactly surprising. And so in 1650, the Omani Arabs overthrow the Portuguese and they become independent once again. And then these Omani Arabs then push out of Oman and they come down south. And when they find Portuguese Mombasa and Portuguese Zanzibar, they conquer it. And once they conquered Zanzibar, this is over 100 years later, the Arabs actually realized that the location of Zanzibar is better. Strategically, it's better for them. And so the royal family, the Sultan of Oman, moves his capital from Oman to Zanzibar. Uh, so in East Africa, it's like the Portuguese have successes, but they also have failures, right? Their obvious success is that they conquer Mozambique and they hold on to Mozambique for almost 500 years, from 1507 to 1975. Actually, no, Mozambique is actually earlier than 1507, so I'll go fix that. I think. I think it's earlier, so I'll go fix that. They don't have the entire country, but they just have the coastal area down here. They have Mozambique in the coastal area down here as their base to sort of block any ships that pass through the straits between Mozambique and Madagascar. But in terms of what do you call it? Their grand strategic plan to control, all the choke points and control the Indian Ocean trade, well, obviously that failed. And not only that, they gradually lose control over the parts that they had conquered earlier, and they're pushed out. And in this case, they're pushed out by the local Arabs. Well, they're not really local, but by the Arabs who had a long-term connection to East Africa. All right. So now we're going to talk about South Africa, or the southern part of Africa. The southern part of Africa was inhabited initially by the Khoisan people. The Khoisan are actually two separate groups. They are a non-Bantu African people. The Khoi are the pastoralists, and the San are the hunter-gatherers. Today, they're mostly Protestants. And what happens is that the Khoisan lived in this huge area in southern Africa, but the Europeans will eventually land in Cape Colony and begin to move north, and the Bantu speakers will come from the north and push south. So the Khoisan are kind of like squeezed in between. Among the Bantu speakers, the two prominent ones are the Zulus and the Xhosa. Today, they're mostly Protestants. And among the Europeans, the most important, I think, are the Dutch settlers. So the Dutch arrived starting in the 1600s, and their descendants begin to call themselves Afrikaners. So this is because the English show up, or the British show up, and when the British show up, the descendants of these Dutch settlers begin to say, you guys may be from Europe, but we are African. And so they call themselves Afrikaners. The other name that they use for themselves is we are Boers, Boer meaning farmer, right? Because they lived in the countryside and they were farmers. These people are mostly Protestants, by the way. They believe in the Dutch Reformed Church. All right. So why are the Dutch here? Well, remember the story about how, the journey between Europe and Asia was so long that they needed to refuel, restock, and they also needed a place to settle so that they could, eat good food and restore their health until they discovered the cure to scurvy, which is vitamin C. So the Dutch picked Cape Colony as the place to settle. Cape Colony was actually a good location, but the reason why the Portuguese didn't choose Cape Colony is because Cape Colony is too far. So if you're going from Portugal, then my guess is that, in terms of distance, coastal Central Africa was probably the best place to stop and, regain your health before moving on. The Dutch would extend further because they start even further back, and they extend further. Instead of stopping at Central Africa, they stop all the way at Southern Africa. So what that means is the Dutch sailors in the early years, almost all of them got scurvy. That's just bad. I mean, the Dutch sailors that traveled between Europe and Asia, or the Dutch travelers, basically ran a very high risk of scurvy because they didn't know what they were doing. And they would land in Cape Colony, and they would have to rest there for a lot longer to restore their health. So the Dutch East India Company saw this as a way station, and they wanted to actually put in as little money as possible to maintain the Cape Colony. But what happens is as time goes on, the population slowly increases, and as the population slowly increases, the people who grow up there think of this as their real home. They don't think of Holland as their home anymore. Um, and because the Khoisan are pastoralists or hunter-gatherers, they don't own land, or they don't have the concept of land ownership because they're constantly moving. So the Dutch settlers continue to push outwards and outwards, and Cape Colony actually grows quite fast. Um, Now, the interesting story here in Cape Colony is that the Dutch initially tried to enslave the Khoisan, the locals. But the Khoisan know the land, so when they find out that they've been enslaved and they're not happy about it, they just run away. They know where to go to get the food, they know where to go to get the water. So what do the Dutch do? What the Dutch do is they get slaves in Southeast Asia, where the Dutch East India Company is also operating, and they bring these Indonesian slaves, Southeast Asian slaves, all the way to Africa. And these guys, even if they escape, don't know where to get food, don't know where to get water, so they can't run away. Again, this shows you how the history of the world, starting in the modern period, really is connected. The first 300 years of the modern period is the early modern period, 1500 roughly to roughly 1800. So there you go. So this is a map of Cape Colony under Dutch settlement, and you can sort of see, that it just expands really quickly. So that before the British come and take it over, this is on the eve of the French Revolution. The Cape Colony under Dutch settlement is actually quite large, and a lot of it is basically now just farmland because the goal is to feed and make the sailors who land at Cape of Good Hope healthy. Um, by the eve of the French Revolution, they know that the cause for the disease was the lack of vitamin C. So by this point in time, a lot of the conditions have improved. But that doesn't change the expansionary impulse at this point because uh, the local Dutch settlers are now calling this their home, and you know they don't want to go back to Holland. So if they have many sons, then their sons or daughters will try to get more land for themselves, and so the borders just keep expanding. And because the Khoisan are hunter-gatherers, they don't have a concept over land ownership, or they can't really resist the Dutch well. And of course, the Xhosa and the Zulus are coming down from the north, so the Khoisan really are squeezed. We don't really know what's going on with the Zulus and the Khoisan. The Zulus and the Khoisan will know much more in detail once we get to the modern period, once we get to after 1800, when the Cape Colony is controlled by the British. Because what's going to happen is the Cape Colony, when it's controlled by the British, some of the Dutch settlers don't like being ruled by the British, and so they leave Cape Colony and they go north, and they will establish two independent Afrikaner republics. Um, so one is called Orange Free State, and the other one is called Transvaal, across the Vaal River. Um, and once they are set up there, then we actually have more information about the Xhosa and the Bantus, Xhosa and the Zulus, the Bantu speakers. The British also fight a series of wars against the Zulu Empire as well. So that we can talk about that when we get to that. But for now, that's it with Southern Africa. So let's now move on to Central Africa. So I really wanted to talk about how Ethiopia, sort of, won and lost with the contact with the Portuguese. The same story applies to Central Africa. The Congolese kingdom basically won and lost by contact with the Portuguese. So what do I mean? All right. So Central Africa, this area here, was controlled by the Kingdom of Congo. And the Bakongo people are a Bantu-speaking people, and today they're mostly Catholic. Just south of that is currently Angola, but that was established as a Portuguese colony at the city of Luanda. So Luanda is here, right? And Angola was initially, the Portuguese colony of Angola was initially just on the coast. Later on, the Portuguese colony would expand. All right. So what do we mean by positives and negatives? Here we go. 1483, as the Portuguese are moving down south the coast of Africa, they make contact with the Kingdom of Congo. And the king of Congo, the Joao First of Congo, uh, converts to Catholicism, and he's one of the earliest converts to Catholicism. And a few years later, 1526, it's not few, 30, 30 some odd years later, King Afonso of the Congo converts his people to Catholicism, and the Kingdom of Congo becomes a Catholic kingdom. So, as a Catholic kingdom in these 30 some odd years, one of the things that happens is that the Portuguese basically, instead of trading with the other African kingdoms, decide to trade primarily with the Kingdom of Congo. And when they trade primarily with the Kingdom of Congo, the Portuguese are able to sell guns to the King of Congo. This is why it was very useful, because with these guns, the King of Congo can now wage wars of expansion. They can fight enemies that surround the kingdom, and when you defeat the enemy and you capture them as prisoners of war, you then sell those prisoners of war into slavery, and with that money, you buy more guns so that you can keep expanding your empire. You can keep expanding your kingdom. So there was a brief period where the Congolese really were, the dominant power. But here's what happens: the Portuguese merchants were not happy with the prisoners, with just the prisoners of war. The demand for slaves in the colonies of Brazil and the Caribbean were so huge that Portuguese traders resorted to trickery, and sometimes even kidnapped people and sold them into slavery in the Americas. And this was not kosher, right? The Kingdom of Congo was perfectly fine selling its enemies into slavery. I mean, they're your enemies, so who cares? But they were not okay when their own people were being tricked into slavery. So African slavery in the Kingdom of Congo and in West Africa typically worked in such a way so that if you uh, was captured in war, if you were a soldier and you were captured in war, as a prisoner of war, you were turned into a slave. Another thing that could happen is if you committed a crime, as part of your punishment, you could be turned into a slave. And a third thing that could happen is that if you owed too much money in debt, then you could sell yourself or you could sell your family into slavery. And then with that money, you pay off your debts. So there are many ways to enter the slave situation. But as long as the slaves were not exported overseas to like the Americas, as long as the slaves lived inside the Kingdom of Congo, here's what happened. Okay, so the slaves themselves may be slaves, but if they have kids, then the kids were generally treated as being free. And the kids grew up to be full-fledged members of the local society. So yeah, I mean, it's slavery, but it's only for one generation if you think about it, at worst, right? And if you're lucky, you get manumitted early, and so you're no longer a slave. Um, but the important point here is that children are not treated as slaves, whereas in the New World, in both North America and South America, children of black slaves continue to be slaves, and that's pretty bad, right? In the Islamic world, as long as you convert to Islam, then the children of slaves. If you were a pagan African, you were captured by a Muslim African, and then you were sold into slavery, and you were now in the Middle East. If you converted to Islam, then if you have any kids thereafter, your kids would be free, right? So again, it's also one generation only, unlike in the Americas. Uh, so despite having this, intergenerational slavery, how it's the slave status basically passes down from parent to child, uh, because the demand for laborers was really high, the Brazilian colonies and the Caribbean colonies, instead of importing women, they tended to import men who could work harder. And men obviously don't reproduce, and when overwork these men, they die, and that is precisely what happened. Right? So to fill in the void, they have to constantly buy new slaves from Africa. And when there's not enough slaves because there's like a lull in war and there's not enough prisoners of war, one of the things that the Portuguese sailors did, and we have this on record, is you would have a party on your boat. You would invite African musicians, Congolese musicians, to play music on your boat. And then in the middle of the night, when everybody is drunk, the ship, lifts anchor and sets sail. And the next morning, when everybody wakes up with a hangover, they find out that the ship is in the middle of the ocean, and they're not going to go back. The Portuguese ship then just ships those people all the way to the New World, and the Portuguese ship captain just lies and says, "Hey, these are all slaves," and sells them all. This is what the kingdom of Congo was not happy about. The kingdom of Congo was not happy about this. You can't trick people into slavery. Selling our enemies into slavery is fine, but you can't trick our own people into slavery. And King Afonso actually writes a letter to the King of Portugal saying, "Why are you doing this? Please stop." And the reply from the King of Portugal is, "You guys have nothing to sell but slaves. Accept it. Otherwise, you're not going to get our guns," basically. Accept it. I mean, it's like a really rude letter. And it's not exactly then surprising that relations between the Portuguese and the Congolese sour very quickly, and war is going to break out between the Portuguese and the Congolese. The Portuguese had set up shop in Luanda, which I said earlier, and Luanda is right here. And it becomes a center of the slave trade between Central Africa and the Americas. In terms of the number of slaves shipped over to the Americas, um, something like 40% or 45% of the slaves are just under 50% are shipped out of Congo and Angola, right, are shipped out of Central Africa. So it's like it just shows you how busy the Portuguese were in selling slaves. All right, so what happens in a conflict between the Congolese and the Portuguese? Well, as relations sour, the Portuguese decide to see if they can actually defeat the Congolese and impose their will. But in 1622, when that Portuguese army comes to the Congo, the Congolese army is able to defeat the Portuguese. And 20 years later, the Congolese come into contact with the Congolese who had come into contact with the Dutch, because the Dutch are now trading starting in the 1600s. The Portuguese sign all, not the Portuguese, the Congolese, the Congo signs an alliance with the Netherlands, the Dutch, and together they actually do manage to expel the Portuguese from Angola. Now, there's two problems. One is that the Dutch are Protestants and the Congolese are Catholics. So they're slightly uneasy about this, alliance that you have between Catholics and Protestants. And the second problem is that when the Dutch merchants do arrive after kicking out all the Portuguese merchants, turns out that the number one reason why the Dutch merchants are there is because they want to engage in the slave trade. And I imagine similar kinds of shenanigans happen, just like when the Portuguese merchants were in charge. So 5 years later, when Congolese support of the Dutch basically dry up, the Portuguese return and the Portuguese defeat the Dutch and they retake Luanda and Angola. Luanda, the city, and Angola, the region around the city. And once the Portuguese are back, the relations that I guess was okay because they were separated. They're now neighbors again, and relations start to sour once again. And finally, in 1665, the Congolese king is killed in battle against the Portuguese forces, and that is the marker for the start of the Congolese Civil War. So the Congolese aristocrats basically go to war against each other to see who will be the next king of Angola, right? In the middle of this turmoil in the Congo, the Portuguese think that this might be the perfect opportunity to conquer the Congo and rid their problem once and for all. But the Portuguese expeditionary force is defeated once again. They had been selling all these guns to the Africans. The country of Congo probably is awash with guns. So anybody could just pick up a gun and fight against the enemy if you are willing to defend your land. And so, with guns available all over, it's not exactly surprising that the Portuguese would eventually lose. All right. So that's one thing that happens. Another thing that happens is that the Congolese aristocrats who are fighting against each other to see who will be the next king, who will be the next ruler of the Congo, basically start selling their own people into slavery. Right? They come up with these crazy laws so that and they basically say if you make any mistake and you break this crazy law, then you and your entire family will be enslaved. And so they were looking for some sort of like, pseudo legal ways, fake legal ways to get more slaves, legally, and then sell them off to the Portuguese. So this is what I mean, right? Contact with the Portuguese basically causes a flowering of Congo culture. You can actually see images of Congolese aristocrats painted in the Renaissance style. It also causes, the Congolese to be the dominant power in the region for a while. But when you do engage in the slave trade, well, first you think that you're selling your enemies into slavery, but then when the buyers say that's not enough, you begin to come up with harsh penalties, or you try to, make sure that the debts are collected in a timely fashion, and you try to get more people into slavery that way through legal means, and then eventually the people then begin to, uh, you know, come up with crazy ideas to sell each other into slavery, sell their fellow countrymen into slavery. So it's a story of how the country slowly got corrupted through the slave trade. Right, the profits that's available from the slave trade, the guns that you can get from the slave trade was just so tempting that it pushed people in this direction. And I think this is one of the tragedies of Africa. Right, if the was there a way for the Africans to avoid this? And I think there was. So Japan actually is a story, is an example that you can use to actually illustrate this. So Japan was also a system, was also in a state of warring states in the 1500s. This warring states period in Japan basically lasts from 1477 all the way to 1568. Sometimes people say to 1603. So it's roughly 100 or 100 plus years of constant internal warfare. And during this period, as I said in the previous lecture, you know, samurai lords would go to war, sometimes capture enemy civilians, and then sell them into slavery. This was pretty common. They would actually sometimes go to the enemy territory, kidnap people, bring them back to your own home domain, and then settle them in your home domain. Maybe not sell them into slavery, but you're kidnapping people. So these terrible things happen in Japan too. And when the Portuguese arrive, the Japanese actually do sell Japanese slaves to buy guns. We have records of 10 women and children sold into slavery to buy 1 barrel of gunpowder. But Japan doesn't fall into the same trap that Africa did, right? Slavery comes to an end, and uh, there's no slave trade. There's no slave trade, right? That continues. So what's the difference here? I think one difference is that Japan was unified, and once you have a very strong political entity that can impose its will on the rest of the country, then it's a lot easier to say, all right, we're going to ban the slave trade, so that's it, no more slave trade. And then people, lower down the hierarchy sort of has to follow that. Otherwise, you're breaking the law, then you could be punished. So that's one. The problem with Africa is that Africa is huge. What people don't get is that inside this continent, you can stick in all of Western Europe, you can stick in all of China, you can stick in all of America, you can stick in all of India, and you can stick in Japan, right? The African continent is the second largest continent on Earth. And so there's going to be no political entity to unify all of it. That's just fundamentally impossible. And even in this region, no kingdom emerged to become the dominant kingdom to unify the area and then say to the Portuguese, here are the terms of our deal. Now, the other reason why Japan was able to do that is because they were no longer dependent on foreign guns. So you have to have this political will to, end the slave trade, but you also have to have the technological ability to make the guns yourself. And my suspicion is that the Africans probably could make the guns themselves, but what they probably couldn't do is make the gunpowder, just like in the story of Japan. So in the story of Japan, Japan comes into contact with the Portuguese. The Portuguese show, so it's the Portuguese mercenaries on Chinese boats, actually. But you have these Portuguese mercenaries on Chinese boats, and he's got this gun, and he shows it to the Japanese. one guy, samurai lord, buys it for like a ridiculously expensive price, and then the samurai lord gives the gun to his blacksmith and orders his blacksmith to make a copy of it. And within 1 year, the blacksmith is able to make the copy, a very similar copy to the Portuguese mercenary's gun. The only problem is that he couldn't figure out how to make the screw at the back of the barrel so that when you bang, the thing doesn't like, blow out. Uh, and that was resolved when Japanese merchant ships traveled between Japan, Southeast Asia, and India. And I think the blacksmith daughter got married to a uh, a foreigner. I forget exactly if it was Indian or European, but she got married to a foreigner, specifically a foreign blacksmith, and then she then learned how to make the screw, and then told that information to her dad, and then Japan was now able to make its own guns. I suspect that the Africans could probably also make their own guns. The problem is gunpowder, right? And Japan couldn't make gunpowder for a while. And that's where you get that story of 10 women and children being sold for 1 barrel of gunpowder. Um, so guns obviously require gunpowder for it to be useful. Gunpowder was invented in China, and it requires 3 component parts. One's charcoal, one's sulfur, and the other one's saltpeter. So charcoal and sulfur, you sort of understand. It's pretty easy to get almost anywhere in the world, um, if you know where you're looking. Saltpeter, not necessarily. So being invented in China, obviously there are saltpeter deposits in China. There are also saltpeter deposits in India, big ones. India would actually be a major exporter of saltpeter for a while. The Middle East also had their own deposits of saltpeter. It turns out that Europe didn't have major deposits of saltpeter, and Japan also doesn't have deposits of saltpeter. So what do you got to do? What this means is you got to use early chemistry to figure out how to make saltpeter. And the solution in both Europe and in Japan was to use rotting organic material. So rotting poop. So we have stories of rows and rows of rotting sheep manure because they're making wool over there in Europe. And they use that to make saltpeter. And in the case of Japan, we have stories of people using poop and making transforming that into saltpeter. Uh, by the way, it's not just Japan. The Europeans were also turning poop into saltpeter as well. The British Crown had a government office where their job as government officials was actually to go barge into people's homes and take the soil from near their bathrooms, near their toilets, where you have all this like poop that was piled up. And then that was used to turn out gunpowder because gunpowder was a strategic product necessary for your guns. But regardless of whether you were in Japan or in Europe, basically you needed to have a high enough density of people or animals, domesticated animals, to be able to make gunpowder. And the Kingdom of Congo and most parts of Africa did not have a high enough population density to make this happen. So if you can't make gunpowder, then why bother making the gun in the first place? So I think that's the reason why no political unity and the inability to make gunpowder, or the inability to make your own guns as a system, was the reason why the Africans were reliant on this Atlantic trade to buy more guns. Because let's imagine that you are a king and you try to take the high road and say, I don't want to engage in the slave trade. It's immoral. My people, even if they're enslaved after one generation, they're no longer slaves, or their children are no longer slaves. I hear that when they go to the Americas, the children are turned into slaves. That's the babies are slaves. I mean, that's just ridiculous. It's just wrong. I'm gonna do that. And then a few years pass, and even though you might have had guns in the past, you no longer have gunpowder. And because without gunpowder, your guns are useless, when you go to the war next time around, your neighbor who was doing the slave trade has guns and gunpowder, and you lose. And When you lose, your people is captured into slavery and sold off as slaves. Or maybe not your entire people, but your army is captured as prisoners of war at battle if they when they lost, and they're all sold into slavery, and you lose your kingdom. So structurally, because the country was not country, the continent was not unified. There was this constant skirmishing going on, and because there's this constant fighting going on, you need to engage in the slave trade to get the guns. So, it's a cautionary tale, right? Working with the Portuguese would temporarily actually expand your kingdom, but if you don't play your cards right, then the slave trade will slowly corrupt your own country, and you will eventually sell your own people into slavery for uh, the use of guns. So, after the period of civil war comes to an end in 1718, which is about almost 50 years of civil war, the Kingdom of Congo is a shadow of its former self. It's no longer a stable political entity. Um, and the slave trade actually comes to an end in 1839. I suspect that what happened is that by this point in time, the slave trade has been going on for so long that the local economy has fully incorporated the slave trade as part of its system. And when the slave trade comes to an end, because Britain forces the Portuguese to end the slave trade in 1839, the economy begins to crumble. And when the society is no longer able to function, when the government is no longer working, when the economy is probably collapsing for various reasons, but I think including the end of the slave trade or the sudden end of the slave trade, the Kingdom of Congo uh, asked the Portuguese king, or the King of Congo asked the Portuguese king to be allowed to be his vassal. So he will no longer be the equal of the Portuguese king. He will be a vassal of the Portuguese king. And with that, uh, the Congo becomes a protectorate, right? Um, Shortly thereafter, in 1884, 1885, European powers get together at Berlin to decide what to do about Africa. This is called the Scramble for Africa. And in this Scramble for Africa, most of the Kingdom of Congo is incorporated as part of the new uh, Portuguese colony of Angola. Right? So Angola, instead of being just a city and its surrounding areas, now becomes a territorial unit that's now part of modern Angola, essentially. The other parts that don't become part of Angola go to the Belgians. It becomes part of Belgian Congo. Well, to be more precise, it becomes part of King Leopold's Congo. It was called Congo Free State. I'll talk about this when we get there in the modern period. All right. So we're almost at the end here. Now we're going to talk about West Africa. Uh, so West Africa is also very important because this is the place where about half the slaves are exported out of Africa to cross the Atlantic. So if 40 to 45% came out of Angola, Congo, then roughly half, 50% came out of West Africa. So what happened here? So West Africa also has a long history of slavery, and this is because the northern part of West Africa is the area where you have these giant Muslim empires. So probably the most famous is the Mali Empire, but you also have the Songhai Empire, and you have these empire builders that periodically rise to create empires in the north, and they're mostly Muslims. So what happens is that these empires then go south and raid these pagan areas to the south of them, and then they capture these people and then they sell them into slavery. Right? So once these people accept Islam, then obviously the kids can't be enslaved. So this engagement with the slave trade was pretty old, and West Africa was an exporter of slaves through the trans-Saharan trade route to the Arab world. Uh, when the Europeans eventually came to conduct more trade, and they said that there's a demand for slaves and that we want to buy your slaves, the West Africans were like, oh, Well, we've had slavery for a while, new customers. There's some new people who want to buy slaves. Fine. And what this means is that warfare that was kind of endemic after the collapse of the Songhai Empire. So the Songhai Empire was this empire that managed to maintain unity in the area. Songhai would eventually be replaced by the Moroccans, but the Moroccan Empire also collapses afterwards. So when all that collapse happens, you have general anarchy, and countries are constantly at each other's throats, and so people are, generally sold into slavery often, um, captured in war and then sold into slavery often. But eventually, what happens is that uh, slavery or selling your prisoners of war into slavery was a result. It wasn't the goal of the war. The goal of the war was something different. Like, you have a territory that is ancestrally mine, so I'm going to wage war to get it back. You besmirch my honor, so I have to go to war to, make my honor whole. There are other reasons to go to war, right? But towards the end of the early modern period, as we get towards the period when they're trying to abolish the slave trade, warfare in West Africa basically becomes about capturing people to be sold into slavery. So, you know, selling people into slavery becomes a goal in and of itself. That's terrible, uh, because that means now that the economy is now dependent on the whole slave trade, which means not only is it just countries that's doing it, it also means that there's now these private individuals who's going to engage in slave raiding to maximize profits too. So we have stories where uh, people in the kids when they play, in West Africa, various places. Uh, one child always has to play lookout. One child has to climb up a tree and keep an eye out. And when they see an unknown adult coming near them where the kids are playing, they shout out, "Hey, an unknown guy is coming! Run!" And they'll have to run away because kids would easily be captured and then sold into slavery. So terrible, right? So the coastal areas were pagan. But as the Europeans arrive, what happened to the Congo happens as well, and the people slowly adopt Christianity. So today, uh, you have people in the northern part of West Africa who are Muslims, and the people in the southern part of West Africa, basically along the coast, that are Christians. Um, among these people on the coast, the Yoruba are probably the most famous because, if I'm not mistaken, it is from the Yoruba religion that you get that you get Vodun, which then becomes voodoo, right? And to the east of the Yoruba people are the Igbo people. The Igbo people are also mostly Christian, but they were pagan. And the difference between the Yoruba and the Igbo, if I'm not mistaken, is that the Yoruba created in a kingdom or an empire, and the Igbo lived in republics, city-state republics, if I'm not mistaken. All the way out west, you have the Ashanti Kingdom. The Ashanti Kingdom, the main people are the Akan language speakers. Today, they're mostly Christian, and it's basically modern-day Ghana. Okay. So this is the details of inland West Africa. So I talked about, like, the broad picture there, but here's the details. So the Kingdom of Mali is the first kingdom to, expand and, conquer huge parts of inland West Africa. And Mansa Musa is probably the famous emperor. I'm pretty sure I talked about him in the previous lecture on Africa. And, this is the start of the conversion to Islam, right? Uh, After the Mali Empire declines, the next dominant empire is the Songhai Empire. But the Songhai Empire, in turn, is overthrown by the Moroccans. So what happens is that Ahmad al-Mansur was a candidate to be the Moroccan king when he was young, um, and he had a rival claimant, and so they were going to go to war to see who would be the next king of Morocco. When the Portuguese heard about this, they wanted to, influence what happens in Morocco because although the Portuguese ships were pirates in the Indian Ocean, when the Portuguese ships came back from Asia and they rounded Africa, and as they were going back towards Portugal, North African ships, including ships from Morocco, would sail out and attack Portuguese ships and take their cargo. So, the Portuguese may have been acting as pirates for a while in the Indian Ocean, but by 1591, by late 1500s, you have the North Africans who are now pirates preying on Portuguese ships. It's like the piracy just never ends, right? I guess people want to make a quick buck without working too hard. It's just like, come on, man. Anyway, when the Portuguese king intervened in this to see so that the guy who he backs will be the next king of Morocco, and then he would get that guy to end the piracy on the Portuguese. The Portuguese king dies in battle. So this battle is called the Battle of Three Kings, 1578, and Ahmad al-Mansur becomes the victor of that battle. And what he tries to do is not only is he looking towards the piracy, but he's also looking towards trade inside Africa, and he realizes that if he can dominate the trade between the North African coast and West Africa and control the trans-Saharan trade route, then his kingdom will be wealthier. And so he does that, right? Now, why did I go off on a tangent about this? I went off on a tangent about this because the Portuguese king dies in battle in the Battle of Three Kings. When the Portuguese king dies in battle, he leaves no child, he leaves no heir. And because he leaves no heir, the closest person by blood to the Portuguese throne is claimed to be King Philip II of Spain. So in 1580, because of this intervention in Africa, Spain and Portugal get unified as one country. It's called the Iberian Union. So, I mean, this is not that far off, but this is obviously African events impacting what's going on in Europe. But then once Portugal and Spain unify into one giant empire, well, then you get that image of all of South America, Brazil and Latin America being unified under one crown, and a huge chunk of Mexico, because back then Mexico went all the way to California. It had Texas and California. So this huge part of America, the Philippines and Portuguese colonies that dot along the line in the Indian Ocean, and Philip II famously could say, "The sun never sets on the Spanish Empire." uh, all right. So after the Moroccan Empire collapses, so after Ahmad al-Mansur dies, the Moroccan Empire basically begins to collapse. Um, you don't have a unification, as I was talking about earlier. The last attempt at major unification was by Umar Tall and Tidiane Tall, but that fails because in 1890 the French conquered the western part of inland West Africa, and the local African attempt to restore unity and impose its will on its people and on the surrounding environment basically uh, is cut short. Uh, in the case of the eastern part of inland West Africa, basically Nigeria, you have the kingdom of Kano, which we don't really know when it started, but it was a Hausa kingdom that adopted Islam. And then this was replaced by the Sokoto Caliphate, which was a Fulani kingdom in the western part. So, here's a map. So Nigeria is roughly in this area here. So Mali is in this area here. So the Moroccans basically come down from the north and they conquer all of this to try to get that trade route between north and south. The Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire have a trade route going east-west, and they continue to race south. So in the south down here, the Hausa and the Fulani are fighting over here, right in the eastern part. So in 1890, the western part over here is conquered by the French. The eastern part over here is conquered by the British. And there you go. No more unity. So coastal West Africa. Oh, this is an unnecessary slide. Let me delete that slide. So this is the image of coastal West Africa at the time. The name of the coast is basically what the European traders got from the local people, or what they thought that they would get. So notice here it says the Grain Coast, Gold Coast, Slave Coast, and it says Benin, right? Gulf of Guinea. Antic Ocean. I have no idea what Antic is. It's cut off there. And that is there is Mali, right? That says Senegal. So that's probably Senegal. Um, that's Kano there. Yeah. All right. Anyway, so Gold Coast, obviously, this is where they were exporting gold from here. Slave Coast is a place where they were getting slaves from. Grain Coast is the place where you get an African spice from, African spice called grains. So that's what these places are named after. So this entire region is the place where European traders would show up and they would buy slaves. Because there's no major kingdom that unified this region, basically what happens is you go to a local port and you buy a few slaves, and then you put these slaves on your boat, and then you move to a next port, and then you keep repeating the process until finally your boat is full, and then you transport your cargo all the way from Africa to the Americas. People as cargo. All right. So they were roughly. Oh no, wait, yeah. So I did the math wrong. So this area here is roughly 45%, and the Angolan and Congo is roughly 40%. So together they make up roughly 85% of the slave trade, and another 5% of the slave trade comes from Mozambique. And then there's like bits and pieces of slave trade from other parts that come out of Africa to the New World. So the bulk of the slaves that come out of the Africa and arrive in the New World come out of West Africa, or they come out of Central Africa. So that's why the Europeans are there. So they're obviously selling them guns, right? The merchants are buying cotton cloth, by the way. The African merchants buy cotton cloth, but the African kings buy guns. Sometimes the merchants probably buy guns and then they sell that to the African kings. Anyway, what do you do with these guns? Well, in the case of the Yoruba, they actually unified most of the Yoruba land, most of the land that they lived under, and they created a single polity. Um, Interestingly, they didn't really rely on infantry, they relied on cavalry to do so. It was an aristocratic empire. Dahomey, which is to the west of them, and I don't know if it's in here. I don't know if you can see Dahomey in here. I don't. But Dahomey was in the western parts of the Yoruba Empire, Oyo Empire, Yoruba's Oyo Empire, but they broke off and became independent. Um, and Dahomey is interesting because you can Google and look this up, but they are a people who actually had female warriors. So for the longest time, people thought that the idea of Amazons, warrior women, were kind of like BS and not true. Well, it turns out that in historical reality, there really were warrior women. So they are real. They are the Dahomey Amazons, and we have actually photos because they gained their independence in 1823. So, you know, photographs become common by the 1850s. So it's not that far off. So the Igbo, who also conducted the slave trade, these people relied on infantry and they relied on guns. Right? So Ashanti is the Asanteman kingdom, which is over on this side here near the Gold Coast. Um, and they unified most of the area there in the Gold Coast. And they used a combination of gerontocracy and theocracy, so old people and religious leaders ruled the country. But like the Igbo, they also use gunpowder. They also use infantry, guns, as their main main arm. So you can make the argument, right? I think the last, yeah. So you have to engage in slave trade, otherwise you lose because your neighbors. Uh, you can make the argument that the slave trade in West Africa hurt them a lot, but it also helped them because it prevented them from being colonized. Because Africans buying all these guns from Europeans, that means Africa is awash with guns. And when the Europeans, they're also not unified as well. So if you get into war with a local African kingdom and say, let's say, the British are at war with a local African kingdom and say, all right, fine, I'm not going to sell you guns anymore. Well, the French or the Dutch or the Portuguese might show up to them and say, hey, I hear that the English aren't selling you guns anymore. We'll sell you guns. So not only are the Africans, constantly, uh, divided and therefore can't show a united front, the European side is also compete against each other and can't show a united front. So guns would just be plentiful in this area. And because of that, if the primary goal is to buy slaves in Africa to be sold in the Americas, why conquer this area? So the slave trade, ironically, prevents colonialism in Africa, which is interesting. It's like I don't want to give any positives. I don't want to think that there was any positives to the slave trade, but uh, if you stop for a moment and think about it, that's the one positive, that it actually prevents Africa from being colonized. Uh, Often people use the argument that climate and disease is the reason why Africa is left alone, but this is wrong. So I can explain that to you. Anyway, once the slave trade comes to an end, it's at that point that the European countries can now actually work together and then divide up Africa. And that is precisely what happens in the scramble for Africa. So Britain is going to get Nigeria and Ghana. France is going to get Mali and Benin in the inland part of, well, I mean, you know all these countries. I'll show you a colonial map when we get to modern Africa, modern history. The Portuguese are going to concentrate on Angola and Mozambique. I'll add that here. And the Dutch, well, they leave West Africa because they don't get anything there, and they also lost Cape Colony. So the Dutch will focus their attention on Southeast Asia, on Indonesia. And in West Africa, only one country will remain independent, and that's Liberia. So, what is Liberia? Liberia is a country that was founded by freed American slaves. So, American slaves in the 13 colonies who were freed and didn't want to stay in the United States basically went back to Africa and created the country of Liberia. Uh, Now, what happens is that the freed slaves from the Americas become the new elite in Liberia, and they don't directly enslave them, but they treat the locals pretty harshly. It's like you would think that because of the experience that you had, you would treat the locals more nicely, but no, that's not what happens. So, uh, Liberia is the only country that remains independent, and everybody else gets colonized in West Africa. And it's because the slave trade has now come to an end, so that the Europeans can now cooperate with each other. And you know, how can I possibly say that slave trade was actually had a beneficial impact? Well, it didn't. Slave trade as a whole had a negative impact. It's absolutely clear. The economics prove this. Uh, Everywhere else in the world, the population has increased. Africa is the one place where the population remains stagnant. If not, it goes down slightly bit, just a little bit, because of all the people that they quote unquote exported through the slave trade. And um, up until really modern times, like modern times with like industrial technology, and up until the early modern times, power or influence was people. If you had more people, you had a richer country. And Africa basically robbed themselves of that because of the slave trade. So overall, obviously, it was a negative. But if there was one positive, it's that it prevented them from being colonized. So, people try to say that the colonization didn't happen because Africa was hot and there was all these climate. I was like, I don't buy this argument because climate didn't matter. Southeast Asia and India had a similar climate to Africa and had similar types of diseases that the Europeans were not used to. It didn't matter. They still freaking conquered it. So Malaysia, for example, has the Malacca Sultanate and was conquered by the Portuguese in 1511. The Philippines basically went under Spanish colonization from 1565 to 1898, and Indonesia, which is also super hot, basically gets conquered by the Dutch East India Company, and famously, India gets conquered by the British. So the point here is that the Europeans have become capitalist, right? By the 1500s, capitalism is beginning to emerge. And as people become more and more capitalist, the goal becomes to make money. And if that meant conquest was going to be easy or that it was going to be more profitable, well, then so be it. They would go and conquer it, right? But if you can make money without the conquest, so be it. Let's make money through just trade. No need to conquer. So I think it's more about the nature of capitalism and the African ability to defend themselves that basically is the cause for why Africa was left alone, not climate and disease. Although I wouldn't say climate and disease is not important. It was important, but it's not the main reason why it didn't happen. Because if that was the case, then you can't explain, Southeast Asia and India. All right, so that takes us to early modern Africa. I think I showed you, the positives and negatives of what happened in early modern Africa. Um, It's a lot of ups and downs. That's all I can say. It's no way to no way to have a nice, easy summary because we're talking about multiple civilizations across a vast continent. But uh, uh, the fact that all these places had to somehow or another deal with the impact of world trade is important and is something that is shared. And by the way, I talk about this in my Western civilization course, but the impact of world trade changes Western civilization as well, right? Western civilization was fundamentally a Christian civilization, and over time, it transforms to become a capitalist civilization. So, all right, that's it for now. I'll stop the share, I'll stop the recording, and I'll see you guys in the next video.